"It is kind of you, and I swear I am willing. I haven't got another drop of perspiration left in me. I have been spinning around and around the wheel like a squirrel. It is so dark I can't tell which way she is swinging till she is coming around like a whirligig." So Elo took a seat on the bench, panting and breathless. The Black Phantom assumed the wheel without saying anything, steadied the waltzing steamer with a turn or two, and then stood at ease, coaxing her a little to this side and then to that, as gently and as sweetly as if the time had been noonday. When Elo observed this marvel of steering, he wished he had not confessed. He stared and wondered and finally said, "Well, I thought I knew how to steer a steamboat, but that was another mistake of mine." X said nothing but went serenely on with his work. He rang for the leads, he rang to slow down the steam. He worked the boat carefully and neatly into invisible marks, then stood at the center of the wheel and peered blandly out into the blackness fore and aft to verify his position. As the leads shoaled more and more, he stopped the engines entirely, and the dead silence and suspense of drifting followed when the shoalest water was struck. He cracked on the steam, carried her handsomely over, and then began to work her warily into the next system of shoal marks. The same patient, heedful use of leads and engines followed. The boat slipped through without touching bottom, and entered upon the third and last intricacy of the crossing. Imperceptibly she moved through the gloom, crept by inches into her marks, drifted tediously till the shoalest water was cried, and then, under a tremendous head of steam, went swinging over the reef and away into deep water and safety. Elo let his long-pent breath pour out in a great, relieving sigh, and said, "That's the sweetest piece of piloting that was ever done on the Mississippi River. I wouldn't believed it could be done if I hadn't seen it." There was no reply, and he added, "Just hold her 5 minutes longer, partner, and let me run down and get a cup of coffee." A minute later Elo was biting into a pie down in the Texas, and comforting himself with coffee. Just then the night watchman happened in, and was about to happen out again, when he noticed Elo and exclaimed, "Who is at the wheel, sir?" "Excellent." Dart for the pilot-house, quicker than lightning. The next moment both men were flying up the pilot-house companion-way, 3 steps at a jump. Nobody there. The great steamer was whistling down the middle of the river at her own sweet will. The watchman shot out of the place again. Elo seized the wheel, set an engine back with power, and held his breath while the boat reluctantly swung away from a towhead, which she was about to knock into the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. By and by the watchman came back and said, "Didn't that lunatic tell you he was asleep when he first came up here?" "No." "Well, he was. I found him walking along on top of the railings just as unconcerned as another man would walk a pavement, and I put him to bed. Now just this minute there he was again, away astern, going through that sort of tightrope deviltry the same as before. Well, I think I'll stay by next time he has one of those fits, but I hope he'll have them often. You just ought to have seen him take this boat through Helena Crossing. I never saw anything so gaudy before, and if he can do such gold-leaf, kid-glove, diamond breastpin piloting when he is sound asleep, what couldn't he do if he was dead?" Chapter 12. Sounding. When the river is very low, and one steamboat is drawing all the water there is in the channel, or a few inches more, as was often the case in the old times, one must be painfully circumspect in his piloting. We used to have to sound a number of particularly bad places almost every trip when the river was at a very low stage. Sounding is done in this way. The boat ties up at the shore just above the shoal crossing. The pilot not on watch takes his cub or steersman and a picked crew of men, sometimes an officer also, and goes out in the yawl, provided the boat has not that rare and sumptuous luxury, a regularly devised sounding boat, and proceeds to hunt for the best water, the pilot on duty watching his movements through a spyglass meantime, and in some instances assisting by signals of the boat's whistle, signifying try higher up or try lower down. For the surface of the water, like an oil painting, is more expressive and intelligible when inspected from a little distance than very close at hand. The whistle signals are seldom necessary, however, never, perhaps, except when the wind confuses the significant ripples upon the water's surface. When the yawl has reached the shoal place, the speed is slackened. The pilot begins to sound the depth with a pole 10 or 12 feet long, and the steersman at the tiller obeys the order to hold her up to starboard, or let her fall off to larboard, or steady, steady as you go. When the measurements indicate that the yawl is approaching the shoalest part of the reef, the command is given to ease all. Then the men stop rowing and the yawl drifts with the current. The next order is stand by with the buoy. The moment the shallowest point is reached, the pilot delivers the order, "Let go the buoy," and over she goes. If the pilot is not satisfied, he sounds the place again. If he finds better water higher up or lower down, he removes the buoy to that place. Being finally satisfied, he gives the order, and all the men stand their oars straight up in the air in line. A blast from the boat's whistle indicates that the signal has been seen. Then the men give way on their oars and lay the yawl alongside the buoy. The steamer comes creeping carefully down, is pointed straight. The buoy husbands her power for the coming struggle, and presently at the critical moment, turns on all her steam and goes grinding and wallowing over the buoy and the sand, and gains the deep water beyond. Or maybe she doesn't, maybe she strikes and swings. Then she has to while away several hours or days sparring herself off. Sometimes a buoy is not laid at all, but the yawl goes ahead, hunting the best water, and the steamer follows along in its wake. Often there is a deal of fun and excitement about sounding, especially if it is a glorious summer day or a blustering night. But in winter the cold and the peril take most of the fun out of it. A buoy is nothing but a board 4 or 5 feet long, with one end turned up. It is a reversed schoolhouse bench, with one of the supports left and the other removed. It is anchored on the shoalest part of the reef by a rope with a heavy stone made fast to the end of it. But for the resistance of the turned-up end of the reversed bench, the current would pull the buoy underwater. At night, a paper lantern with a candle in it is fastened on top of the buoy, and this can be seen a mile or more, a little glimmering spark in the waste of blackness. Nothing delights a cub so much as an opportunity to go out sounding. There is such an air of adventure about it. Often there is danger. It is so gaudy and man-o'-war-like to sit up in the stern sheets and steer a swift yawl. There is something fine about the exultant spring of the boat when an experienced old sailor crew throw their souls into the oars. It is lovely to see the white foam stream away from the bows. There is music in the rush of the water. It is deliciously exhilarating in summer to go speeding over the breezy expanses of the river when the world of wavelets is dancing in the sun. It is such grandeur, too, to the cub to get a chance to give an order, for often the pilot will simply say, "Let her go about," and leave the rest to the cub, who instantly cries in his sternest tone of command, "Ease starboard, strong on the larboard, starboard give way, with a will men." The cub enjoys sounding for the further reason that the eyes of the passengers are watching all the yawl's movements with absorbing interest if the time be daylight. And if it be night, he knows that those same wondering eyes are fastened upon the yawl's lantern as it glides out into the gloom and dims away in the remote distance. One trip a pretty girl of 16 spent her time in our pilot house with her uncle and aunt, every day and all day long. I fell in love with her. So did Mr. Thornburg's cub, Tom G. Tom and I had been bosom friends until this time, but now a coolness began to arise. I told the girl a good many of my river adventures, and made myself out a good deal of a hero. Tom tried to make himself appear to be a hero too, and succeeded to some extent, but then he always had a way of embroidering. However, virtue is its own reward, so I was a barely perceptible trifle ahead in the contest. About this time something happened which promised handsomely for me. The pilots decided to sound the crossing at the head of 21. This would occur about 9 or 10 o'clock at night, when the passengers would be still up. It would be Mr. Thornburg's watch, therefore my chief would have to do the sounding. We had a perfect love of a sounding boat, long, trim, graceful, and as fleet as a greyhound. Her thwarts were cushioned. She carried 12 oarsmen. One of the mates was always sent in her to transmit orders to her crew, for ours was a steamer where no end of style was put on. We tied up at the shore above 21 and got ready. It was a foul night, and the river was so wide there that a landsman's uneducated eyes could discern no opposite shore through such a gloom. The passengers were alert and interested. Everything was satisfactory. As I hurried through the engine room, picturesquely gotten up in storm toggery, I met Tom, and could not forbear delivering myself of a mean speech. "Ain't you glad you don't have to go out sounding?" Tom was passing on, but he quickly turned and said, "Now just for that you can go and get the sounding pole yourself. I was going after it, but I'd see you in Halifax now before I'd do it." "Who wants you to get it? I don't, it's in the sounding boat." "It ain't either, it's been new painted, and it's been up on the ladies' cabin guards 2 days, drying." I flew back, and shortly arrived among the crowd of watching and wondering ladies, just in time to hear the command, "Give way, men." I looked over, and there was the gallant sounding boat booming away, the unprincipled Tom presiding at the tiller, and my chief sitting by him with the sounding pole which I had been sent on a fool's errand to fetch. Then that young girl said to me, Oh, how awful to have to go out in that little boat on such a night. Do you think there is any danger? I would rather have been stabbed. I went off, full of venom, to help in the pilot house. By and by the boat's lantern disappeared, and after an interval a wee spark glimmered upon the face of the water a mile away. Mr. Thornburg blew the whistle in acknowledgement, backed the steamer out and made for it. We flew along for a while, then slackened steam and went cautiously gliding toward the spark. Presently Mr. Thornburg exclaimed, "Hello, the buoy lantern's out." He stopped the engines. A moment or two later he said, "Why, there it is again." So he came ahead on the engines once more and rang for the leads. Gradually the water shoaled up and then began to deepen again. Mr. Thornburg muttered, "Well, I don't understand this. I believe that buoy has drifted off the reef. Seems to be a little too far to the left. No matter, it is safest to run over it anyhow." So in that solid world of darkness we went creeping down on the light. Just as our bows were in the act of ploughing over it, Mr. Thornburg seized the bell ropes, rang a startling peal and exclaimed, "My soul, it's the sounding boat." A sudden chorus of wild alarms burst out far below, a pause, and then the sound of grinding and crashing followed. Mr. Thornburg exclaimed, "There, the paddle wheel has ground the sounding boat to lucifer matches. Run, see who is killed." I was on the main deck in the twinkling of an eye. My chief and the third mate and nearly all the men were safe. They had discovered their danger when it was too late to pull out of the way. Then, when the great guards overshadowed them a moment later, they were prepared and knew what to do. At my chief's order they sprang at the right instant, seized the guard, and were hauled aboard. The next moment the sounding yawl swept aft to the wheel and was struck and splintered to atoms. 2 of the men and the cub Tom were missing, a fact which spread like wildfire over the boat. The passengers came flocking to the forward gangway, ladies and all, anxious-eyed, white-faced, and talked in odd voices of the dreadful thing. And often and again I heard them say, "Poor fellows, poor boy, poor boy." By this time the boat's yawl was manned and away, to search for the missing. Now a faint call was heard off to the left. The yawl had disappeared in the other direction. Half the people rushed to one side to encourage the swimmer with their shouts. The other half rushed the other way to shriek to the yawl to turn about. By the callings the swimmer was approaching, but some said the sound showed failing strength. The crowd massed themselves against the boiler deck railings, leaning over and staring into the gloom, and every faint and fainter cry wrung from them such words as, "Ah, poor fellow, is there no way to save him?" But still the cries held out and drew nearer, and presently the voice said pluckily, "I can make it, stand by with a rope." What a rousing cheer they gave him. The chief mate took his stand in the glare of a torch basket, a coil of rope in his hand, and his men grouped about him. The next moment the swimmer's face appeared in the circle of light, and in another one the owner of it was hauled aboard, limp and drenched, while cheer on cheer went up. It was that devil Tajbk, 120K. The yawl crew searched everywhere but found no sign of the 2 men. They probably failed to catch the guard, tumbled back and were struck by the wheel and killed. Tom had never jumped for the guard at all, but had plunged head-first into the river and dived under the wheel. It was nothing. I could have done it easy enough, and I said so. But everybody went on just the same, making a wonderful to-do over that ass as if he had done something great. That girl couldn't seem to have enough of that pitiful hero the rest of the trip, but little I cared. I loathed her anyway. The way we came to mistake the sounding boat's lantern for the buoy light was this. My chief said that after laying the buoy he fell away and watched it till it seemed to be secure. Then he took up a position 100 yards below it and a little to one side of the steamer's course, headed the sounding boat upstream, and waited. Having to wait some time, he and the officer got to talking. He looked up when he judged that the steamer was about on the reef, saw that the buoy was gone but supposed that the steamer had already run over it. He went on with his talk. He noticed that the steamer was getting very close on him, but that was the correct thing. It was her business to shave him closely for convenience in taking him aboard. He was expecting her to sheer off until the last moment. Then it flashed upon him that she was trying to run him down, mistaking his lantern for the buoy light. So he sang out, "Stand by to spring for the guard, men." And the next instant the jump was made. Chapter 13. A Pilot's Needs. But I am wandering from what I was intending to do, that is, make plainer than perhaps appears in the previous chapters, some of the peculiar requirements of the science of piloting. First of all, there is one faculty which a pilot must incessantly cultivate until he has brought it to absolute perfection. Nothing short of perfection will do. That faculty is memory. He cannot stop with merely thinking a thing is so and so. He must know it, for this is eminently one of the exact sciences. With what scorn a pilot was looked upon in the old times, if he ever ventured to deal in that feeble phrase, I think, instead of the vigorous one, I know. One cannot easily realize what a tremendous thing it is to know every trivial detail of 1,200 miles of river, and know it with absolute exactness. If you will take the longest street in New York, and travel up and down it, conning its features patiently, until you know every house and window and door and lamp post and big and little sign by heart, and know them so accurately that you can instantly name the one you are abreast of when you are set down at random in that street, in the middle of an inky black night, you will then have a tolerable notion of the amount and the exactness of a pilot's knowledge who carries the Mississippi River in his head. And then if you will go on until you know every street crossing, the character, size and position of the crossing stones, and the varying depth of mud in each of those numberless places, you will have some idea of what the pilot must know in order to keep a Mississippi steamer out of trouble. Next, if you will take half of the signs in that long street, and change their places once a month, and still manage to know their new positions accurately on dark nights, and keep up with these repeated changes without making any mistakes, you will understand what is required of a pilot's peerless memory by the fickle Mississippi 105K. I think a pilot's memory is about the most wonderful thing in the world, to know the Old and New Testaments by heart, and be able to recite them glibly, forward or backward, or begin at random anywhere in the book, and recite both ways and never trip or make a mistake, is no extravagant mass of knowledge and no marvelous facility compared to a pilot's massed knowledge of the Mississippi and his marvelous facility in the handling of it. I make this comparison deliberately, and believe I am not expanding the truth when I do it. Many will think my figure too strong, but pilots will not. And how easily and comfortably the pilot's memory does its work, how placidly effortless is its way, how unconsciously it lays up its vast stores, hour by hour, day by day, and never loses or mislays a single valuable package of them all. Take an instance, let a leadsman cry, half Twain, half Twain, half Twain, half Twain, half Twain, until it become as monotonous as the ticking of a clock. Let conversation be going on all the time, and the pilot be doing his share of the talking and no longer consciously listening to the leadsman. And in the midst of this endless string of half-twains let a single, quarter-twain, be interjected without emphasis, and then the half-twain cry go on again, just as before. 2 or 3 weeks later that pilot can describe with precision the boat's position in the river when that quarter-twain was uttered, and give you such a lot of head marks, stern marks and side marks to guide you, that you ought to be able to take the boat there and put her in that same spot again yourself. The cry of quarter-twain did not really take his mind from his talk, but his trained faculties instantly photographed the bearings, noted the change of depth, and laid up the important details for future reference without requiring any assistance from him in the matter. If you were walking and talking with a friend, and another friend at your side kept up a monotonous repetition of the vowel sound A for a couple of blocks, and then in the midst interjected an R, thus A, etc., and gave the R no emphasis, you would not be able to state, 2 or 3 weeks afterward, that the R had been put in, nor be able to tell what objects you were passing at the moment it was done. But you could if your memory had been patiently and laboriously trained to do that sort of thing mechanically. Give a man a tolerably fair memory to start with, and piloting will develop it into a very colossus of capability, but only in the matters it is daily drilled in. A time would come when the man's faculties could not help noticing landmarks and soundings, and his memory could not help holding on to them with the grip of a vice. But if you asked that same man at noon what he had had for breakfast, it would be 10 chances to 1 that he could not tell you. Astonishing things can be done with the human memory if you will devote it faithfully to one particular line of business. At the time that wages soared so high on the Missouri River, my chief, Mr. Bixby, went up there and learned more than 1,000 miles of that stream with an ease and rapidity that were astonishing. When he had seen each division once in the daytime and once at night, his education was so nearly complete that he took out a daylight license. A few trips later he took out a full license and went to piloting day and night, and he ranked a 1 too. Mr. Bixby placed me as steersman for a while under a pilot whose feats of memory were a constant marvel to me. However, his memory was born in him, I think, not built. For instance, somebody would mention a name. Instantly Mr. Brown would break in. Oh, I knew him. Sallow-faced, red-headed fellow with a little scar on the side of his throat like a splinter under the flesh. He was only in the southern trade 6 months. That was 13 years ago. I made a trip with him. There was 5 feet in the upper river then, the Henry Blake grounded at the foot of Tower Island drawing 4.5, the George Eliot unshipped her rudder on the wreck of the Sunflower. Why, the Sunflower didn't sink until... I know when she sunk. It was 3 years before that, on the 2nd of December. Asa Hardy was captain of her and his brother John was first clerk, and it was his first trip in her, too. Tom Jones told me these things a week afterward in New Orleans. He was first mate of the Sunflower. Captain Hardy stuck a nail in his foot the 6th of July of the next year and died of the lockjaw on the 15th. His brother died 2 years after 3rd of March, erysipelas. I never saw either of the Hardys. They were Allegheny River men, but people who knew them told me all these things. And they said Captain Hardy wore yarn socks winter and summer just the same, and his first wife's name was Jane Shook, she was from New England, and his second one died in a lunatic asylum. It was in the blood. She was from Lexington, Kentucky. Name was Horton before she was married. And so on by the hour the man's tongue would go. He could not forget anything. It was simply impossible. The most trivial details remained as distinct and luminous in his head after they had lain there for years as the most memorable events. His was not simply a pilot's memory, its grasp was universal. If he were talking about a trifling letter he had received 7 years before, he was pretty sure to deliver you the entire screed from memory. And then, without observing that he was departing from the true line of his talk, he was more than likely to hurl in a long-drawn parenthetical biography of the writer of that letter. And you were lucky indeed if he did not take up that writer's relatives, one by one, and give you their biographies too. Such a memory as that is a great misfortune. To it, all occurrences are of the same size. Its possessor cannot distinguish an interesting circumstance from an uninteresting one. As a talker, he is bound to clog his narrative with tiresome details and make himself an insufferable bore. Moreover, he cannot stick to his subject. He picks up every little grain of memory he discerns in his way, and so is led aside. Mr. Brown would start out with the honest intention of telling you a vastly funny anecdote about a dog. He would be so full of laugh that he could hardly begin. Then his memory would start with the dog's breed and personal appearance, drift into a history of his owner, of his owner's family, with descriptions of weddings and burials that had occurred in it, together with recitals of congratulatory verses and obituary poetry, provoked by the same. Then this memory would recollect that one of these events occurred during the celebrated hard winter of such and such a year, and a minute description of that winter would follow, along with the names of people who were frozen to death, and statistics showing the high figures which pork and hay went up to. Pork and hay would suggest corn and fodder would suggest cows and horses would suggest the circus and certain celebrated bareback riders. The transition from the circus to the menagerie was easy and natural. From the elephant to equatorial Africa was but a step. Then of course the heathen savages would suggest religion, and at the end of 3 or 4 hours' tedious jaw, the watch would change, and Brown would go out of the pilot-house muttering extracts from sermons he had heard years before about the efficacy of prayer as a means of grace. And the original first mention would be all you had learned about that dog, after all this waiting and hungering. A pilot must have a memory, but there are 2 higher qualities which he must also have. He must have good and quick judgment and decision, and a cool, calm courage that no peril can shake. Give a man the merest trifle of pluck to start with, and by the time he has become a pilot he cannot be unmanned by any danger a steamboat can get into, but one cannot quite say the same for judgment. Judgment is a matter of brains, and a man must start with a good stock of that article, or he will never succeed as a pilot. The growth of courage in the pilot-house is steady all the time, but it does not reach a high and satisfactory condition until some time after the young pilot has been standing his own watch, alone and under the staggering weight of all the responsibilities connected with the position. When an apprentice has become pretty thoroughly acquainted with the river, he goes clattering along so fearlessly with his steamboat, night or day, that he presently begins to imagine that it is his courage that animates him. But the first time the pilot steps out and leaves him to his own devices, he finds out it was the other man's. He discovers that the article has been left out of his own cargo altogether. The whole river is bristling with exigencies in a moment. He is not prepared for them, he does not know how to meet them, all his knowledge forsakes him, and within 15 minutes he is as white as a sheet and scared almost to death. Therefore pilots wisely train these cubs by various strategic tricks to look danger in the face a little more calmly. A favourite way of theirs is to play a friendly swindle upon the candidate. Mr. Bixby served me in this fashion once, and for years afterward I used to blush even in my sleep when I thought of it. I had become a good steersman, so good indeed that I had all the work to do on our watch night and day. Mr. Bixby seldom made a suggestion to me. All he ever did was to take the wheel on particularly bad nights or in particularly bad crossings, land the boat when she needed to be landed, play gentleman of leisure 9/10 of the watch, and collect the wages. The lower river was about bankful, and if anybody had questioned my ability to run any crossing between Cairo and New Orleans without help or instruction, I should have felt irreparably hurt. The idea of being afraid of any crossing in the lot in the daytime was a thing too preposterous for contemplation. Well, one matchless summer's day I was bowling down the bend above Islin, brimful of self-conceit and carrying my nose as high as a giraffe's, when Mr. Bixby said, "I am going below a while, I suppose you know the next crossing." This was almost an affront. It was about the plainest and simplest crossing in the whole river. One couldn't come to any harm whether he ran it right or not, and as for depth, there never had been any bottom there. I knew all this perfectly well. Know how to run it? Why, I can run it with my eyes shut. How much water is there in it? Well, that is an odd question. I couldn't get bottom there with a church steeple. You think so, do you? The very tone of the question shook my confidence. That was what Mr. Bixby was expecting. He left without saying anything more. I began to imagine all sorts of things. Mr. Bixby, unknown to me of course, sent somebody down to the forecastle with some mysterious instructions to the leadsmen. Another messenger was sent to whisper among the officers, and then Mr. Bixby went into hiding behind a smokestack where he could observe results. Presently the captain stepped out on the hurricane deck, next the chief mate appeared, then a clerk. Every moment or two a straggler was added to my audience, and before I got to the head of the island I had 15 or 20 people assembled down there under my nose. I began to wonder what the trouble was. As I started across, the captain glanced aloft at me and said, with a sham uneasiness in his voice, "Where is Mr. Bixby?" "Gone below, sir." But that did the business for me. My imagination began to construct dangers out of nothing, and they multiplied faster than I could keep the run of them. All at once I imagined I saw shoal water ahead. The wave of coward agony that surged through me then came near dislocating every joint in me. All my confidence in that crossing vanished. I seized the bell rope, dropped it ashamed, seized it again, dropped it once more, clutched it tremblingly one again and pulled it so feebly that I could hardly hear the stroke myself. Captain and mate sang out instantly and both together, "Starboard lead there, and quick about it." This was another shock. I began to climb the wheel like a squirrel, but I would hardly get the boat started to port before I would see new dangers on that side, and away I would spin to the other, only to find perils accumulating to starboard and be crazy to get to port again. Then came the leadsman's sepulchral cry. 500 EEP4. Deep 4 in a bottomless crossing, the terror of it took my breath away. 1000 RK3, 1000 RK3, quarter less 3, half Twain. This was frightful. I seized the bell ropes and stopped the engines. Quarter Twain, Mark Twain. I was helpless. I did not know what in the world to do. I was quaking from head to foot, and I could have hung my hat on my eyes, they stuck out so far. Quarter less Twain, 9.5. We were drawing 9. My hands were in a nerveless flutter. I could not ring a bell intelligibly with them. I flew to the speaking tube and shouted to the engineer, "Oh Ben, if you love me, back her. Quick Ben, oh back the immortal soul out of her." I heard the door close gently. I looked around and there stood Mr. Bixby, smiling a bland, sweet smile. Then the audience on the hurricane deck sent up a thundergust of humiliating laughter. I saw it all now, and I felt meaner than the meanest man in human history. I laid in the lead, set the boat in her marks, came ahead on the engines, and said, "It was a fine trick to play on an orphan, wasn't it? I suppose I'll never hear the last of how I was ass enough to heave the lead at the head of 66. Well, no, you won't maybe. In fact, I hope you won't, for I want you to learn something by that experience. Didn't you know there was no bottom in that crossing?" "Yes, sir, I did." "Very well then, you shouldn't have allowed me or anybody else to shake your confidence in that knowledge. Try to remember that. And another thing, when you get into a dangerous place, don't turn coward. That isn't going to help matters any." It was a good enough lesson, but pretty hardly learned. Yet about the hardest part of it was that for months I so often had to hear a phrase which I had conceived a particular distaste for. It was, "Oh Ben, if you love me, back her." Chapter 14. Rank and dignity of piloting. In my preceding chapters I have tried, by going into the minutiae of the science of piloting, to carry the reader step by step to a comprehension of what the science consists of, and at the same time I have tried to show him that it is a very curious and wonderful science, too, and very worthy of his attention. If I have seemed to love my subject, it is no surprising thing, for I loved the profession far better than any I have followed since, and I took a measureless pride in it. The reason is plain. A pilot in those days was the only unfettered and entirely independent human being that lived in the earth. Kings are but the hampered servants of Parliament and people. Parliaments sit in chains forged by their constituency. The editor of a newspaper cannot be independent, but must work with one hand tied behind him by party and patrons, and be content to utter only half or two-thirds of his mind. No clergyman is a free man and may speak the whole truth, regardless of his parish's opinions. Writers of all kinds are manacled servants of the public. We write frankly and fearlessly, but then we modify before we print. In truth, every man and woman and child has a master, and worries and frets in servitude. But in the day I write of, the Mississippi pilot had none. The captain could stand upon the hurricane deck, in the pomp of a very brief authority, and give him 5 or 6 orders while the vessel backed into the stream, and then that skipper's reign was over. The moment that the boat was under way in the river, she was under the sole and unquestioned control of the pilot. He could do with her exactly as he pleased, run her when and whither he chose, and tie her up to the bank whenever his judgment said that that course was best. His movements were entirely free. He consulted no one, he received commands from nobody, he promptly resented even the merest suggestions. Indeed, the law of the United States forbade him to listen to commands or suggestions, rightly considering that the pilot necessarily knew better how to handle the boat than anybody could tell him. So here was the novelty of a king without a keeper, an absolute monarch who was absolute in sober truth, and not by a fiction of words. I have seen a boy of 18 taking a great steamer serenely into what seemed almost certain destruction, and the aged captain standing mutely by, filled with apprehension but powerless to interfere. His interference, in that particular instance, might have been an excellent thing, but to permit it would have been to establish a most pernicious precedent. It will easily be guessed, considering the pilot's boundless authority, that he was a great personage in the old steamboating days. He was treated with marked courtesy by the captain, and with marked deference by all the officers and servants, and this deferential spirit was quickly communicated to the passengers, too. I think pilots were about the only people I ever knew who failed to show, in some degree, embarrassment in the presence of travelling foreign princes. But then, people in one's own grade of life are not usually embarrassing objects. By long habit, pilots came to put all their wishes in the form of commands. It gravels me to this day to put my will in the weak shape of a request, instead of launching it in the crisp language of an order. In those old days, to load a steamboat at St. Louis, take her to New Orleans and back, and discharge cargo, consumed about 25 days on an average. 7 or 8 of these days the boat spent at the wharves of St. Louis and New Orleans, and every soul on board was hard at work, except the 2 pilots. They did nothing but play gentlemen uptown, and received the same wages for it as if they had been on duty. The moment the boat touched the wharf at either city, they were ashore, and they were not likely to be seen again till the last bell was ringing and everything in readiness for another voyage. When a captain got hold of a pilot of particularly high reputation, he took pains to keep him. When wages were $400 a month on the upper Mississippi, I have known a captain to keep such a pilot in idleness under full pay, 3 months at a time, while the river was frozen up. And one must remember that in those cheap times $400 was a salary of almost inconceivable splendor. Few men on shore got such pay as that, and when they did they were mightily looked up to. When pilots from either end of the river wandered into our small Missouri village, they were sought by the best and the fairest, and treated with exalted respect. Lying in port under wages was a thing which many pilots greatly enjoyed and appreciated, especially if they belonged in the Missouri River in the heyday of that trade, Kansas times, and got $900 a trip, which was equivalent to about $1,800 a month. Here is a conversation of that day. A chap out of the Illinois River with a little sternwheel tub accosts a couple of ornate and gilded Missouri River pilots. "Gentlemen, I've got a pretty good trip for the up-country and shall want you about a month. How much will it be?" $1,800 apiece. "Heavens and earth, you take my boat, let me have your wages and I'll divide." I will remark in passing that Mississippi steamboatmen were important in landsmen's eyes, and in their own, too, in a degree, according to the dignity of the boat they were on. For instance, it was a proud thing to be of the crew of such stately craft as the Alex Scott, or the Grand Turk. Negro firemen, deck hands, and barbers belonging to those boats were distinguished personages in their grade of life, and they were well aware of that fact too. A stalwart darky once gave offense at a Negro ball in New Orleans by putting on a good many airs. Finally, one of the managers bustled up to him and said, "Who is you anyway? Who is you? Dat's what I wants to know." The offender was not disconcerted in the least, but swelled himself up and threw that into his voice, which showed that he knew he was not putting on all those airs on a stinted capital. "Who is I? Who is I? I let you know mighty quick who I is. I want you niggers to understand dat I fires de middle do on de Alex Scott." That was sufficient. The barber of the Grand Turk was a spruce young Negro, who aired his importance with balmy complacency, and was greatly courted by the circle in which he moved. The young colored population of New Orleans were much given to flirting at twilight on the banquettes of the back streets. Somebody saw and heard something like the following one evening in one of those localities. A middle-aged Negro woman projected her head through a broken pane and shouted, very willing that the neighbors should hear and envy, "You Mary Ann, come in de house dis minute. Stannin' out da foolin', long wid dat low trash, and he's de barber offen de Grand Turk wants to converse wid you." My reference a moment ago to the fact that a pilot's peculiar official position placed him out of the reach of criticism or command brings Stephen W. naturally to my mind. He was a gifted pilot, a good fellow, a tireless talker, and had both wit and humor in him. He had a most irreverent independence too, and was deliciously easygoing and comfortable in the presence of age, official dignity, and even the most august wealth. He always had work, he never saved a penny, he was a most persuasive borrower. He was in debt to every pilot on the river and to the majority of the captains. He could throw a sort of splendor around a bit of harum-scarum, devil-may-care piloting that made it almost fascinating, but not to everybody. He made a trip with good old Captain Y. once and was relieved from duty when the boat got to New Orleans. Somebody expressed surprise at the discharge. Captain Y. shuddered at the mere mention of Stephen. Then his poor, thin old voice piped out something like this. "Why, bless me, I wouldn't have such a wild creature on my boat for the world, not for the whole world. He swears, he sings, he whistles, he yells. I never saw such an Injun to yell. All times of the night, it never made any difference to him. He would just yell that way, not for anything in particular, but merely on account of a kind of devilish comfort he got out of it. I never could get into a sound sleep, but he would fetch me out of bed, all in a cold sweat with one of those dreadful war whoops. A queer being, very queer being, no respect for anything or anybody. Sometimes he called me Johnny. And he kept a fiddle and a cat. He played execrably. This seemed to distress the cat, and so the cat would howl. Nobody could sleep where that man and his family was, and reckless, there never was anything like it. Now you may believe it or not, but as sure as I am sitting here, he brought my boat a-tilting down through those awful snags at Chicot under a rattling head of steam, and the wind a-blowing like the very nation at that. My officers will tell you so. They saw it. And sir, while he was a-tearing right down through those snags, and I a-shaking in my shoes and praying, I wish I may never speak again if he didn't pucker up his mouth and go to whistling. Yes, sir, whistling Buffalo Gals, can't you come out tonight, can't you come out tonight, can't you come out tonight? And doing it as calmly as if we were attending a funeral and weren't related to the corpse. And when I remonstrated with him about it, he smiled down on me as if I was his child, and told me to run in the house and try to be good, and not be meddling with my superiors. Once a pretty mean captain caught Stephen in New Orleans out of work, and as usual out of money. He laid steady siege to Stephen, who was in a very close place, and finally persuaded him to hire with him at $125 per month, just half wages, the captain agreeing not to divulge the secret and so bring down the contempt of all the guild upon the poor fellow. But the boat was not more than a day out of New Orleans before Stephen discovered that the captain was boasting of his exploit, and that all the officers had been told. Stephen winced, but said nothing. About the middle of the afternoon, the captain stepped out on the hurricane deck, cast his eye around, and looked a good deal surprised. He glanced inquiringly aloft at Stephen, but Stephen was whistling placidly and attending to business. The captain stood around a while in evident discomfort, and once or twice seemed about to make a suggestion, but the etiquette of the river taught him to avoid that sort of rashness, and so he managed to hold his peace. He chafed and puzzled a few minutes longer, then retired to his apartments, But soon he was out again, and apparently more perplexed than ever. Presently he ventured to remark with deference, "Pretty good stage of the river now, ain't it, sir?" "Well, I should say so. Bankful is a pretty liberal stage. Seems to be a good deal of current here." "Good deal don't describe it. It's worse than a mill race." "Isn't it easier in towards shore than it is out here in the middle?" "Yes, I reckon it is, but a body can't be too careful with a steamboat. It's pretty safe out here, can't strike any bottom here, you can depend on that." The captain departed, looking rueful enough. At this rate, he would probably die of old age before his boat got to St. Louis. Next day he appeared on deck and again found Stephen faithfully standing up the middle of the river, fighting the whole vast force of the Mississippi, and whistling the same placid tune. This thing was becoming serious. In by the shore was a slower boat clipping along in the easy water and gaining steadily. She began to make for an island chute. Stephen stuck to the middle of the river. Speech was wrung from the captain. He said, "Mr. W., don't that chute cut off a good deal of distance?" "I think it does, but I don't know." "Don't know? Well, isn't there water enough in it now to go through?" "I expect there is, but I am not certain." "Upon my word, this is odd. Why, those pilots on that boat yonder are going to try it. Do you mean to say that you don't know as much as they do?" Why, they are $250 pilots. But don't you be uneasy. I know as much as any man can afford to know for $125. The captain surrendered. 5 minutes later Stephen was bowling through the chute, and showing the rival boat a $250 pair of heels.